A couple things you just hit on that I want to get to. But first, it's that conversation of sort of this push and pull that we're seeing between the push for more transparency, but then government officials or government bureaucracy, having that concern over national security. You said something in remarks after the hearing that I want to read. You said, quote, "My hope is that we got to get some more transparency. That's really the hope for me. This is about government transparency. I'm all for protecting national security, but that can't just be a shield to deny the American people the basics of what we know about UAPs." So if you could talk a little bit about this push and pull again between the push for transparency, but also concerns over national security. And as a congressional lawmaker, how do you work through that fine line of getting more information to the American people, or even obtaining more information for yourself while also being respectful and cognizant of national security?
Well, listen, here's a good example. When we went to go kill Osama bin Laden, we did it with military stealth helicopters that nobody knew existed, right? I'm okay that if we have military capabilities that we don't broadcast because we don't want, foreign actors to be aware of our military, some of our secret military programs. That's okay, and the American people accept that because that helps maintain our military superiority that China and Russia don't know everything. But if we are in the UAP business and we're developing UAPs, and even worse yet, if we're reverse engineering technology based on stuff that has crash landed here from other civilizations, we can't just tell the American people that's not true forever, right? The American people deserve to know whether some of that is true, maybe not the full extent of it, because again, there's national security issues. But to fully keep the American people in the dark, look, we're learning now through the new telescope that the universe is a much larger place than we even anticipated. So to assume there's no other intelligent life out there, the probabilities are that there is. The real question is, have we as a society, as a world, interacted with other intelligent life? And I think the American people deserve to know if that's true or not at the end of the day. And whether there are foreign countries that have these UAPs, that's also something the American people deserve to know. Look, we have satellites now that take pictures of every single solitary thing that happens at every single solitary moment now. You can't do anything these days without there being satellite imagery of it. And so clearly there's more that we know. The idea that there's 170 UAP incidents that we can't describe, I don't actually think that's true. I think we can describe them. I just think we're unwilling to.
Another thing that you mentioned in your previous answer that I wanted to jump off of was sort of this conversation surrounding Grush right now and previous issues he's had with mental health. That sort of brings up the conversation about whistleblower protections, right? Congressman Burchett told me that there were some individuals who were supposed to testify at the hearing who were advised not to. Senator Marco Rubio spoke to our partners at News Nation, and he said that public figures with, quote, high clearances have come forward with claims, but they're fearful of their jobs and their personal safety. Does this highlight the need for stronger protections for whistleblowers? And what role can Congress play in protecting these individuals who come forward with information that at the end of the day is really important for having these important conversations?
100%. This David Grush thing is a perfect case. It's a perfect example of why there needs to be more protection. First of all, again, if what he was saying was just totally untrue, why come out and try to discredit him with this, former PTSD thing? Also, whoever did that wanted to have a chilling effect on somebody else who might come out. Again, why? If there's nothing to talk about, if it's all fake, if there's nothing to describe, then you don't need to chill anybody else from coming out. And so again, it just shows that there is something here that they're hiding because of the efforts that they're going to. That hearing almost didn't happen. There were outside forces trying to prevent that hearing from ever happening. And so,
when you say outside forces, what exactly do you mean by that? Who exactly are you talking about?
There were other agencies that were invited to attend that refused to participate. There were agencies that didn't want that hearing to happen. There was staff that was trying to prevent that hearing. I'm not going to go into all the details. I'll let Tim and Anna talk about that further. But that hearing almost didn't happen. And so, there is definitely a collective effort to not talk about this stuff more. And again, that begs the question, why? Right? And if this is all false and it's all fake, then what we've seen just doesn't make any sense. Matt Gaetz and Anna Paulina Luna and Tim Burchett, they saw photos down at that military base that they can't explain and they can't talk about that are classified. And so there are definitely more things I think the American people deserve to know. They deserve to have some level of disclosure here. And this is going to happen. I mean, it's eventually going to happen because as our technology changes and more people are getting photographs and videos of these UAPs, right, people are going to start to believe their own eyes. And they're gonna listen to these pilots that are seeing these things firsthand accounts that can't explain the speed or the G-force of anything that's known with today's current aviation technology.
Sticking on whistleblower protections, because I think it's an important point in conversation, is there a role here for Congress to help improve these whistleblower protections? Because, of course, whistleblowers coming forward is really crucial to some of the work that you guys do on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, and we can do that in the NDAA, which is still up in the air, obviously, as it's being negotiated between the Senate and the House. We can do that in the NDAA, especially when it comes to this UAP stuff. So we can give additional protection even in this area.
And are there conversations? I know, of course, the House and the Senate have passed their separate bills. They're now going to have to be reconciled before the September 30th deadline. Are you aware of any conversations ongoing about improving whistleblower protections in the NDAA?
Yeah, we're having those conversations. We're just trying to figure out what the language might look like and what we think we can get passed.
Got it. And then another thing you brought up was overclassification of information, right? That's been one of the main roadblocks to being able to receive more information. In your opening statement at last month's hearing, I want to read part of it. You said, quote, overclassification of information away from the American public or even Congress contributes to today's politics. Talk a little bit about more what you mean by that. Do you mean the divisive politics, the polarization? And then again, does Congress have a role here, and how can Congress help decrease this overclassification to help, put more information about not just UAPs, but potentially other topics into the public sphere?
Sure. The overclassification is twofold. I mean, I sat in a SCIF the other day, and they showed us a map of something, and they said that map was classified. And quite frankly, it was a public map of a country, right? And so to say that thing was classified makes no sense, and they couldn't even explain why it was classified, right? So it's so clear that there's an overclassification of things. And when I mean the overclassification contributes to today's politics, well, look, there's going to be partisan politics, and the other side is always going to try to spin something a certain way. But when they ask the government for certain documents, and the government says, we're not giving it to you for 3 months, for 6 months, okay, that leads people to believe that there's a nefarious reason why the government is not giving those documents, or a political reason, right? And we've kind of seen that on this Hunter Biden stuff. That this 1023 form, which they couldn't see because it's classified, right? And then what happens is members come out and just lie about what the form says to the media, because at the end of the day, the form isn't public, so we can't fact check it, right? And so, that's what I mean by the overclassification is leading to additional politicization of issues.
And then how can Congress help decrease this problem, or at least chip away at it?
Well, I mean, obviously, we can pass, laws and definitions of what is classified or not classified. But again, we have the power of the purse, and we got to deal with these agencies and the bureaucracy that has been built because Congress has become ineffective, right? I mean, we see these agencies just growing and this bureaucracy just growing and more rulemaking going on because Congress has failed to do their role, because we're too busy just trying to figure out how we're going to win the media cycle or win the next election, or how we're going to investigate somebody to try to help our side. I mean, that's really Congress's main function now. Is it's a giant PR comms agency. It's not a lawmaking body anymore. And so we can make it better by getting back into the lawmaking business and getting these agencies back under our control.
I have a question from an audience member. We have had audience members submitting questions for the event. This is from Kirk Collins, who's a researcher at Blue Blurry Lines. They ask, will future hearings involve scientists questioning witnesses instead of politicians? I thought that was an interesting concept because, of course, this topic of UAPs is, very nitty gritty. It's very in the weeds. It's, there's a lot of nuance to it. Do you see any situation where there would potentially be scientists questioning some of these witnesses at a hearing?
Well, we could do a field hearing, right? We could do a field hearing where we invite some scientists to do that. Also, scientists can always submit these questions to us, and sometimes that happens. Sometimes you see questions that a politician asks that was submitted by an expert in that particular field. So that happens all the time, right? So I can see that happening maybe in a field hearing. I mean, there's been some talk between Tim and Ann and some others about maybe doing a CODEL out to a location that supposedly is housing some of this information. So these conversations are going on. I know people want this dam to break as fast as possible, but if they've watched how Congress and government works. It doesn't work, at the speed of light. It works very slow. But there are Democrats and Republicans. Again, this was a bipartisan, nonpartisan issue, if you watch that committee, that have more questions about government transparency. And so we want to make progress faster, don't get me wrong, but it's unfortunately just going to take some time.
Now, the last question I have for you, you're obviously a freshman member of Congress. You were just sworn in back in January. You've had a long career in local Florida state politics. You were in the Florida legislature. I'm curious, though, how did you find yourself getting involved in this topic of UAPs on Capitol Hill? You've become one of the leading voices on this topic. I mean, coming into Congress, did you ever expect that this would be one of your first and arguably largest pushes of your first term in Congress?
Well, I'm a big Star Wars fan, right?
So that's where it comes from.
So there's that, obviously, right? I got Grogu in my office. My dog's name is Obi, after Obi-Wan Kenobi. So there's that aspect. But no, this is not something I actually thought we would be working on. But quite frankly, I think the government gave us reasons to work on it. And when you see these whistleblowers come forward and you see these pilots come forward, I think their testimony was very compelling, and I think they were very legitimate. And believable. And then you see how the government responds, and you see some of these leaks that come out trying to discredit witnesses. Again, that just leads to more questions. And so, I wasn't someone who was a big believer in any of this stuff, but there's enough there that intrigues not just myself, but intrigues, I think, the American public on, again, why there's 170 UAP episodes that we can't explain. No, I think there's explanations for that, and I think the government doesn't want to give us those explanations, and that's not satisfactory. Again, that's why I said that overclassification and classifying everything can't be a shield to some disclosure. The American people deserves to know some of the basic facts of this, which is, are these UAPs ours? Are they not ours? Are they from this world? Are they not from this world?
And then I guess another question I have for you is other leaders of this push. We talk about Gates, we talk about Luna, also from Florida. You served in local legislature and the state legislature. Do you think that there's any coincidence there that Florida is sort of becoming one of the largest voices here, or at least Florida lawmakers? Do you think there's a specific reason why, or is it just luck of the draw?
Yeah, I think it's just a coincidence. I mean, obviously, Ann and I know each other. We got elected around the same time, and Gates and I served in the Florida House together. Obviously, we're very polar opposites on the partisan spectrum there, but we know each other, right? And so sometimes it breeds some, when you know each other and you're able to build a relationship, it breeds some trust to be able to work on some of these issues. And so maybe that has a fact to it. But look, they were the ones who also went to the facility in the Panhandle where they were denied entrance, and they were originally denied the availability to see these pictures. And then through some, working with the chairman of the committee, they were able to see some of the evidence. And so that happened in Florida. And when I found out about it, I reached out to them and, wanted to help, because the idea is that, we should not be denied, congressmen should not be denied the ability to go in a facility, into a military facility, and look at photos. And again, why? Why were they denied? Why were the photos not allowed to be showed to them? That continues. There's example after example after example of agencies and government getting in the way of information. And that's why I want to continue to pull at this thread.
That actually brings me to one more thing I wanted to ask you. You touched on it a bit earlier, the possibility of a field hearing. This was also something that Congressman Burchett had mentioned. In your opening statement at last month's hearing, you said, quote, if there's nothing to conceal, let Congress go to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, the Dugway Proving Ground, or even Groom Lake in Nevada. We should have disclosure today. We should have disclosure tomorrow. The time has come. Are there conversations, and is there a legitimate push ongoing right now to try and visit those facilities? And would it potentially be for a field hearing? Like, sort of take us behind the scenes of what some of these conversations are and what would look like going to those, what it would look like for Congress to go to some of those facilities.
Oh, listen, I think we should do a CODEL. I mean, it could be a classified CODEL to one of these facilities. Obviously, there might be areas they can't show us. That's fine. But we should be allowed access. And if there's evidence there, we should be shown it. I mean, we have classification. There's no classification that a congressman does not have. We're able to see all this stuff. We have to see it in a skiff, sometimes, and that's fine. And so if there's things at these facilities and they have to show us in a classified setting, we'll do that. But I think we should try. I think we should try to get into one of these places. I think they should have to show it. And if they deny us entrance, I think that also is very interesting. And by the way, if they won't let us in, I think we should do a field hearing right outside the building. And the optics of that, but we're not allowed into this facility again. the military will have to explain why that is.
One thing's for sure, there's much more to come on this conversation, on this topic, both UAPs in general, potential field hearings. Congressman Jared Moskowitz, Democrat from Florida's 23rd Congressional District, thank you so much for joining us. Really interesting conversation.
Thanks, Michael.
Republican Congressman Tim Burchett of Tennessee has been one of the loudest voices for increased government transparency when it comes to UFOs. I sat down with him last week. Here's that conversation. Congressman Tim Burchett, thank you so much for joining us today. First question I have is, there was a really fascinating hearing last month with those three witnesses who spoke about either their personal experiences witnessing UAPs or hearing accounts from others. I was curious to know, what did you find that was most surprising or most interesting during that hearing?
Well, none of it was surprising to me. I had a good attorney tell me one time, never ask a question you don't know the answer to. And I've been following this issue since I was a kid. I mean, literally, I was single digits reading up on this stuff. And so, and I knew I knew the witnesses' backgrounds, and a couple of them I knew personally. So I was very much aware of the questions and where they were leading. But I was delighted that they held up their hand and said it under oath. It's one thing seeing it on an interview on YouTube. It's another thing I've seen it holding up their hand before God and Congress and telling the truth. So I was very much delighted by that.
And then at a number of occasions during that hearing, the witnesses have said that they were unable to get into specifics or fully answer your questions because we were in a public setting. Congresswoman Luna, after the hearing, had mentioned that they were going to work on, her and a group of lawmakers were going to work on having another hearing, speaking to the witnesses rather, in a public setting, perhaps in a skiff. Are you part of those efforts? And can you give a status update, if so, where those efforts are?
Yeah, Matt Gaetz penned a letter that myself and three others signed that we're trying to, we'd like for Speaker McCarthy and, Chairman Comer actually to appoint a select committee just to do just that. So we would have subpoena powers and we could bring those people in. I think the thing is, if they don't have anything to hide, if the Pentagon doesn't, then they shouldn't throw up another roadblock as they've done in the past on some of this other stuff. So hopefully the Chairman Comer, I suspect the American public though is lighting him up and Speaker McCarthy about this issue, because it's polling shows that there's more than half the population believes that there's something else out there, and those are pretty good odds for a politician. I always say 50% plus one is all you need on election day, but they've clearly, and it's really touched a nerve. You mentioned the letter asking to create that subcommittee, that select committee on UAPs that you mentioned. You, Matt Gaetz, a few others wrote that to Speaker McCarthy. First off, have you heard back from Speaker McCarthy? If you can give a status update on where those efforts are. And then second off, other from then having subpoena power, being able to talk about these circumstances in a closed setting, are there any other reasons why a select committee would help and aid your efforts? The skiff, we've run into so many roadblocks there. We're trying to use a third-party administrator and all this stuff. It's just, we're running into a lot of roadblocks there, and that's the problem with this whole thing. It just creates more and more conspiracy theories because our federal government is so arrogant and so bloated, and they can they'll just run out the clock. Now, I'm guilty of this as well, but Americans want their pizzas in 30 minutes or less, and that's about our dadgum attention span. Have you heard back from Speaker McCarthy about this request? No, I have not. I'm going to be, I thought I'd let the dust settle a little bit. I know some folks are vacationing and I don't want to bother him, but he knows my interest, and I've talked with Chairman Comer, and I'm going to talk to him again. And then before we dive into the specifics of what was actually said in the hearing and parse through those details, I'm just curious, the public, as you mentioned, was really captivated during that hearing last month. I think that you mentioned that someone had traveled all the way from Denmark to attend this hearing. Are you guys planning more hearings in the months to come? Because I know there's probably, I'm sure, more information that you guys want to discuss. Yeah, there is, but I think the select committee, if we can get that and kind of get out from, the chairman's kind of is really busy right now. There's a lot of things that we're oversighting over. and judiciary is as well. And if we could set up that separate committee, I think that'd be the avenue to take all those other things down. And I think we could start a series of hearings as well. And I'd like to take them out from under the Capitol at some point. Maybe some of the areas that we think that there's some activity at, and be more open to the public.
Do you think that the only way that we could see more hearings on this topic is if we get that select committee?
I think we could probably do it under the committee system, but it's the current committee system. But I don't think that I think the powers that be will squash it if we do that. That's why I think we need a select committee.
And when you say powers that be, who exactly are you referring to there?
People that make the calls. We couldn't. I mean, you're in the press. That I don't know if you knew this or not, but I was alerted by the press on the day of our press conference, where 4 of us were in there and talking about what we expected from the committee and what was going to happen, and questions we were going to ask, and people that were going to be there. That we announced to our expert witnesses. They were going to put us in one of the rooms that was under construction, for goodness sakes. We had people that we'd called to testify that said no. In fact, they had gotten a call from somebody at the Pentagon, and they were encouraged not to be there. One who I don't know about NASA. I don't know the connection there, but there was some inference that NASA was going to do their own press conference.
Before you mentioned the Pentagon and allegations that the Pentagon has been concealing the program to recover these UAPs and these crafts. And David Grush, one of the witnesses who testified at last month's hearing, he actually alleged that that the government is in possession of non-human material that was recovered from those crash sites. The Pentagon, though, later denied that, and they said, quote, that they do not have, quote, any quote, verifiable information to substantiate claims that any programs regarding the possession or reverse engineering of extraterrestrial materials have existed in the past or exist currently, close quote. So I'm curious, how do you square these two claims that clash so directly?
They never pass an audit. They lose billions of dollars. We don't know where that money goes. They do not tell us out of their arrogance. And Congressmen, honestly, are just gutless. They're afraid somebody's going to come out and say, "Oh, you're against veterans," and that's always the rub. That's why both parties get in the rub on that, and then their budgets grow more and more. We put millions more dollars in this latest bill, that more than the President Joe Biden asked for goodness sakes. So where is all that money going? I just feel like there's a lot going on there with that, and we barely scratched the surface on that.
But how do you square that, that specific claim from David Grush talking about that non-human material, and then the Pentagon coming back and saying that they're not in possession of any of that? How do you square those two contrasting statements?
David Grush is a decorated veteran in Tennessee. That means a whole lot. In Washington, obviously, it doesn't mean anything. You have 3 gentlemen that weren't in any contact with each other, different entities. You have hundreds, if not thousands, of people across the world who are seeing things, who have had encounters, we have these Air Force, these pilots chasing these objects. You can listen to the audio where they're saying, what is it? They're just laughing because they can't. If they don't exist, then tell me what we're looking at on those cameras. Is that our technology? And if so, how are we define our laws of physics as we know? Because at those G's, the human body would literally be liquefied. And there is nothing. We have nothing in our arsenal, and it's not our enemies, or they would control us more so than China does now, but they would. Russia wouldn't be locked down in a worthless war in Ukraine. And we wouldn't be scratching our head every time our enemies do something. We'd put an end to it. So that leaves you with a couple of other avenues. Either it's something extraterrestrial, or it's a project, a skunkworks project of our own, that we are reverse engineering of some craft that we've recovered.
And I want to ask you about another topic that another one of the witnesses discussed. Ryan Graves, he spoke about the stigma surrounding reporting sightings of UAPs. He suggested that may be he said that may be a reason why some folks are sometimes, decide not to report some of these sightings. How, in your opinion, from your perspective, how can Congress help chip away at that stigma surrounding reporting of UAPs? Because it seems to be a central part of this entire puzzle of creating more transparency and informing the public more about what we know about these sightings?
Right. Whistleblower protection, it doesn't really exist for these folks. I've talked to too many of them. They get pulled off the flight line. They say they're debriefed is what the military intelligence, but military intelligence is a whole lot like congressional ethics. It doesn't exist. Nobody believes that it does because of what they're saying. You have a pilot who's pulled off the line 8 hours, interrogated. They have a blemish on their record. They're pulled off the flight line. They're made fun of. They're humiliated. And some of these guys are telling me they're seeing these things on a regular basis. And they've even told me they'll destroy the evidence, the camera footage, the film, if you will, by banging their knee against something or doing something, and it will destroy the film because they know if they go back and they see and that film's out there that they'll have to answer for it, no fault of their own. And that's the kind of thing we're dealing with our military and our Pentagon, who say these things don't exist.
And then I want to ask you about the National Defense Bill, the NDAA, of course. In the Senate version, there was an amendment that was proposed by Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and Senator Mike Rounds, a bipartisan amendment, a Republican and a Democrat, that would have created a review board in charge of declassifying UFO-related records. Of course, the House and the Senate passed their own versions of the NDAA. They're now going to have to be conferenced. Lawmakers are going to have to reconcile those differences and come to a consensus before the September 30th deadline. Are you pushing for that amendment to remain in the compromise bill? And do you think that that amendment will be enough to sort of help in your efforts of creating this more increased transparency and decreasing the stigma?
I think what you'll do is put it all under one central location, and they'll decide that it is not, that it is a national security issue, and somebody will whisper in their ear and shut that down. I think what they need to do is just release the files, the unredacted files.
So you're not confident that this amendment will make it in the compromise?
No, you're asking, you're going to tell, and the Pentagon is helping with this, a group that's helped. I thought, the Pentagon says they don't exist. So what's there to review? I don't trust them. I don't trust them from day one. They're war pimps. That's all, and their business is very good right now. And that's what they're after. They're after more dollars, more of your tax dollars, and they don't need any more. They just need to release these files.
Now we have a couple audience questions, folks who sent in questions to ask you and other lawmakers and experts in the field. So this first question comes from Brian Anslinger, who is an assistant news director at KATU. And he writes, let's assume that UAPs are real objects with multiple origins, extraterrestrial, interdimensional, or otherwise, that are not completely known and within agendas that are not completely understood. How would you advise leaders on transparency and informing the public and the media about the reality of this presence while so many questions remain unanswered?
It's not my job to decide what the public can and cannot handle. I think that deals with censorship. I do not trust a government that does not trust its people. We've got to start exerting our willpower when you have 20% of the population or something eligible that's voting. They get it. They just ring the bell, Pavlov's dog, and we salivate and they come running. If I was in the media, I'd be FOIAing the hell out of the Pentagon and everybody else on every one of these issues and releasing anything that touched UFOs. And now they've changed the name to UAPs to further cloud the issue. I'm sure they had some think tank put that together, but I just don't trust them. I say release it.
Second audience question. This one comes from Jason Wagner. He's a research analyst, and he writes, while maintaining a spirit of nonpartisan solidarity in the search for truth, how do we pressure the executive branch to disclose its knowledge and material? Is the president being cooperative with this effort?
I just don't feel like this issue has a partisan label to it. I think it's bigger than that. I think the people that are profiting from this they might play the party politics. They write the checks to some of the members and legally, of course, but they profit in whoever's in charge. They just they don't want us to turn the spigot off.
This has, as you mentioned, been a very nonpartisan issue. I think that the hearing last month was one of the more bipartisan showings up on Capitol Hill that we've seen in a really long time. You yourself are known to be a very bipartisan member up on Capitol Hill, you're always seen giving fist bumps to your colleagues, whether they're Republican or Democrat. Talk about the nature, if you would, of the issue of UAPs and increasing transparency. Talk about how that's a bipartisan effort and how it doesn't break along partisan lines, but we're really seeing lawmakers from both sides of the aisle work together on this one.
Well, thank you for saying that. The baseline is it's transparency. And the media and Congress ought to realize that we've got people in this government that are taking billions, if not trillions of our dollars that are not being very transparent about where they're spending it. And we deserve some answers.
Congressman Tim Burchett, Republican from Tennessee's 2nd Congressional District, thank you so much for joining us for this really interesting and important conversation.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate y'all keeping it in a serious mode.
Thanks again to Congressman Burchett for speaking with me last week. And now we've heard a lot about the testimony before Congress last month. 3 military veterans testified, sharing their accounts and experiences in coming forward. Retired Major David Grush, retired Commander David Fravor, and former Navy pilot Ryan Graves. Senior national correspondent at News Nation, Brian Enton, joins us now to speak with Ryan Graves. Brian, over to you.
We're joined now by Ryan Graves. He is one of the witnesses from the UFO hearings at the end of last month. Ryan, thank you for being with us. I know this has been like a really, really busy time for you. I've seen you all over the place. There's been so much interest in you and your story, especially ever since the hearings. How are you doing? I mean, it must just sort of feel like a whirlwind for you.
It absolutely has been. It's been incredibly busy after the hearings. People have been very interested and eager to share their stories.
Yeah, I bet. And I want to hear more about the stories that you've been hearing, especially since the hearings. But first, just for people who maybe live under a rock and haven't been paying much attention, if you don't mind, just, and I know you've told the story many times, but just tell us again about your experience. You were a fighter pilot, and tell us about what you saw.
Yeah, I'd be happy to, Brian. I joined the Navy in 2009, and shortly afterwards, I was flying F-18s off the Eastern Seaboard in VFA 11, the Red Rippers. We came back from a deployment aboard the USS Enterprise, and we were then operating off the Eastern Seaboard, and we started to see objects once we upgraded our radar systems. We were seeing objects on our radar that were not supposed to be there. They were performing ways that we weren't expecting a normal aircraft to behave like. And eventually we started to correlate these objects on our other sensors all the way up to our eyeballs.
Had you ever seen anything like that?
Well, I had not. What we ended up seeing was essentially a dark gray or a black cube inside of a clear sphere. And this was happening essentially on a daily basis, where we were having these objects working in our areas. They were operating within probably 1,000 square miles off the Eastern Seaboard. And we'd often have to cancel training flights and move to new areas, or perhaps just cancel altogether and return home if there was no more room. We eventually had to actually submit safety reports to warn other aviators that this was happening in the area so that they could watch out.
Wow. What did your bosses, what did the Navy say about this when you all reported what you saw?
Well, we didn't have really the best way to report these objects. We did have our normal safety channels that we could report aviation safety issues to through the Aviation Safety Center. However, that's not a proactive investigatory unit. That's really more for data collection. So although we submitted these safety reports and we integrated this into some briefs and eventually all the way into our notice to airmen in the local working area, we really didn't have any way for this to be brought to any sort of conclusion. We were simply just doing the best we could to warn people that this was happening and to be careful.
Did you know, Ryan, that it was something that was likely not from this world? I mean, when you first saw them, did you know that right away? Like, what was sort of going through your mind initially?
Initially, we thought they were radar errors, believe it or not. We didn't even think they were physical objects until we started picking these up on multiple sensors. And then eventually with our eyeballs, we realized, hey, this is a serious physical object that we need to be careful of. And then the question of where they actually came from was the next most important one. We initially concluded it was perhaps some type of classified program that was operating the area for some short amount of time and perhaps didn't know that it was causing such a big issue. That was essentially where we had left the issue until we had left on deployment in 2015. There really was no further analysis that we could really do other than say, we don't know what it is. We have to assume it's ours. We can't imagine it would be China or some other nation operating in such a sensitive area. And for us, what else could it be? We really weren't there to speculate. We were just there trying to be the best pilots we could. And when we left for deployment, I think a lot of us, I know at least I did, assume that the problem would eventually continue to escalate until it was resolved via normal channels. I didn't find out until 2017 when the New York Times article came out that showed the UAP videos that the issue did not resolve itself as I had hoped it would, but continued to be a problem. And so I actually reached out to some of my colleagues that were still flying on the Eastern Seaboard to ask them, hey, is this still an issue? Are you still seeing these objects? And they were still seeing them. They were still reporting them. They had them in those notices to airmen, the NOTAMs. And that was it. And that was really the moment when I decided that this was something I wanted to try to speak out about so I could try to help resolve this in any way I could.
Yeah, and talk to us, Ryan, about sort of the challenges that pilots face when they report sightings like this. I know that that's part of your work now with your organization. I mean, they sort of face a lot of pushback in many ways, it sounds like.
Absolutely. And, it's not anything mysterious. I think anyone that has approached the subject for any amount of time is probably familiar with the pushback that this topic can elicit. But when we're aviators, we have to understand that we have professional responsibility to the aircraft and to the lives and souls in the back of that aircraft. And every pilot I've spoken to has always said that has been their number one concern when they care to share this information. They're not UFO hunters. They're not necessarily interested in this topic, but they have that responsibility, and they're frustrated that they don't have an outlet to be able to safely communicate this information in a way that not only gets it out and is safe, but also something is actually done about it so that we don't have this issue constantly popping up.
Is there still a stigma, though? Because we've even heard from some commercial pilots who have spoken to us, not wanting to use their name, but who are, scared to report things because they think they might get in trouble or that their company might be mad or that they could, obviously that's how they earn a living and support their families by flying. And they're worried they could somehow even maybe lose their jobs if they report some of the things that they've seen.
Absolutely. There is some fear that they could be somehow ostracized from the community that they've been with their entire lives, and either hurt administratively or professionally in other ways. So there is absolutely that fear, especially when the reward for coming forward and communicating is essentially so low. So it's just a pretty pragmatic decision, I would think. But that's okay. I think that there are processes that can be put into place that allows pilots to be able to report these cases in a way that they're accountable for. Such as being able to validate their professional experiences, but also providing them by providing them the ability to be anonymous behind certain reporting systems. So
yeah, that seems like that would.
Yeah, those are some of the systems that we're working to be able to implement and recommend. They're systems that are both validated but also anonymous for the pilots that can report.
So since the hearings, have you noticed an uptick or a change in the reports that you're receiving?
I've noticed from commercial pilots that there is absolutely an uptick. Some relatively new information, I guess you could say, is that I am hearing from cases that are more broadly dispersed. So I have been reporting that north of the Atlantic and the northern Pacific as well, pilots that are doing those transatlantic or trans-Pacific flights are seeing various objects, lights that are coming down, behaving in strange ways, holding in a pattern, look like almost like they're dogfighting in space in some way, kind of back and forth with each other. I've reported that coming out near the Big Dipper in the hearings. And since then, I've heard from many other pilots that have reported similar sightings that match the same description in other parts, such as in north-south flights off the eastern seaboard and elsewhere. So we are starting to get a broader data set now that more pilots both feel comfortable and understand that they're not the only ones with this problem. There's one thing that almost every pilot that talks to me says is that I didn't realize that other people were seeing this until I approached it with someone and they said, yeah, I've seen that too. And I've seen that too. So I would encourage any pilots listening to this to, if you have seen something, at least talk to your colleagues about it. See if they've seen it. If not, show it to them.
Yeah, and through your organization, Americans for Safe Aerospace, you get the reports from these pilots. Is there any official way for them to report this information with the government, like with the FAA or the NTSB at this point?
Right now, the legislation for pilots simply suggests that the pilots should submit reports to the local law enforcement if there's some type of altercation with the UAP against their aircraft, or to report just a sighting of one to any number of UFO organizations scattered across the United States. So what we're looking to recommend at Americans for Safe Aerospace is the ability for pilots to be able to catalog and report this as a UAP safety issue within existing aviation safety frameworks.
And when you say like report to law enforcement, I mean, that almost sounds like comical in a way. Like, I mean, are they supposed to like call the local police department of whatever area they're flying over, or?
Exactly. Practically speaking, they're just saying they don't want to have anything to do with these reports. Here are some options if you wish to do something with it. I mean, that practically speaking, that's what the legislation, or that's what the regulation says. And I don't think that's good enough. We don't think that's good enough at Americans for Safe Aerospace. And that's why we're pushing for integration of this as a true aviation safety issue into our existing frameworks.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm curious what you think. You know, David Grush was another one of the witnesses who sat there with you, along with David Fravor at the hearings, at the UFO hearings. And I'm sure you've heard by now. And Grush, of course, for people who don't know, was a high-level intel official who is now saying that he had knowledge of secret government programs where they were covering up crash retrievals of UAPs. And he has now come forward and had to talk about the fact that he had PTSD at one point after serving in Afghanistan, because there was a report that came out sort of trying to discredit him in a sense. His medical records were leaked through a Public Information Act. What do you make of that? I mean, you know, a lot of people are obviously feeling bad for Grush now that he's having to sort of explain, you know, a PTSD situation that so many other veterans have had.
Yeah, you know, it really is really a shame to see that this play out in this very public forum. Mental health in the military is a massively unreported issue, and something that causes a lot of problems, both at home as well as at work for professionals in the military. And that's just due to the nature of the job. Unfortunately, I think that when you start airing the medical history and those type of mental illnesses that some of our soldiers have to deal with at times, it's not just an attack on one of them, but it's an attack on all of us, frankly. I think there's no place in this for any type of attack on anyone that has to admit that they have PTSD or any type of mental illness.
Yeah, and David Grush has spoken about it. He spoke about it to us in the interview we did with him initially. I mean, it didn't seem relevant to us at the time, like you said. I mean, so many service members deal with PTSD, and also the fact that it was very clear that after he was treated for his PTSD, he was able to keep his high-level security clearances, keep working, even I believe got promoted after that. So, you know, I don't think it's fair to sort of use that as a way to say that he, you know, is not telling the truth or something like that.
The Department of Defense has rightly encouraged soldiers to get help for those types of illnesses. And so to now come back and use that as a weapon against anyone within the armed service is I think, a failure of trust of the system.
Yeah, and I think it just goes back, it seems like, to why people are afraid to come forward with their own personal stories. Like they feel like they're somehow going to get called out or ostracized or silenced.
Well, that hasn't been my particular case. I know Mr. Grush has had his instance where it seems like that has been the case, but I would encourage whistleblowers that if they do want to come forward, or witnesses, we do have the resources to be able to support that at safeaerospace.org. And we do have processes in place to be able to bring you before folks on Capitol Hill and within the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office as well, to be able to present your data and move the conversation forward. And that can be done in the strictest of confidences. So I would highly encourage people to make the patriotic decision in this case.
I want to ask you, Ryan, just a few quick questions from the Hill viewers who have sent in some questions and posted, and to see what you think about some of these. Dr. Greg Quinn, he is CEO at Indy Shack. He commented and wanted to ask you, assuming that the U.S. is working covertly on reverse engineering field propulsion, even if the basic premise of a special access program is revealed, wouldn't we want to keep working on that as a classified program? Would we want our adversaries to have that technology?
Yeah, I think this entire conversation needs to unfold under the blanket of national security considerations. And I don't think anyone is suggesting we jump the gun and reveal all of our state secrets. And Mr. Grush has thoughtfully suggested to Congress that he could provide very specific details to some of the claims that he's made behind closed doors. And I would suspect that national security would continue to be considered as the conversation unfolds.
Yeah, and he's also been careful about what he will talk about in an open setting. I know anyone who watched the hearings saw probably that he said over and over again there was so much that he could only talk about in a closed setting. And then from Ryan Staywitz, if what David Grush is saying is accurate, what do you view as the ideal method of relaying this information to the American public? I mean, it seems like, Ryan, like we're already doing that in a sense with the hearings. I mean, it seems like that was a big step forward, not only with what Grush is alleging, but also with what you and Fravor are also saying, which, by the way, I think is different because your stories are real, like eyewitness accounts of what you saw with your own eyes.
Yeah, and I'll just add very quickly, I think even to bifurcate it slightly differently is that a conversation that myself and Mr. Fravor discussed, maybe more so myself, it is about what's happening right now. Pilots are seeing this yesterday, they're probably seeing it today, and they're going to see it tomorrow most likely. In fact, some of the pilots are wondering why we're not flying aircraft up here to take a look at the objects to try to better understand them. So, it's very much happening right now, and it's something that we can, if we invest the right resources into, be able to go investigate and learn more about and eventually come to a conclusion on. Mr. Grush was talking about programs and things that happened in the past, I believe all the way up to 1945 to the current time, which is a historical conversation that I don't have any context on. And I apologize, but the first half of the question is now eluding me.
No, it's fine. But I mean, what you talk about through your organization, Americans for Safe Aerospace, and the fact that pilots are actually seeing things, I mean, it does seem like a real national security risk in the now. I mean, I know you were mentioning a lot of this stuff is stuff from a while ago, but the stuff you're concerned about is stuff that pilots are dealing with every day.
Absolutely. And I think we're doing some of the right things in order to get that information to a state where it can be processed and then ingested into the national security infrastructure. And that's essentially the role that Aero is performing right now. So say they go look at an object off the eastern seaboard, it's behaving anomalously, it's determined to be a adversarial spy balloon. They're going to be able to process that out into the normal, natural, proper organization that can then prosecute that target. Aero is retaining, it seems, the anomalous cases, the cases that they don't have an explanation for, which is what we expected that office to do. Now, I think with the legislation that's currently going through in the Senate attached to the National Defense Authorization Act, it will provide a relief valve of sorts for the review of the information that Aero, and I think elsewhere as well, has already vetted and has said, hey, this is anomalous, we don't know what it is. Is this a matter of national security or not? If the answer is no, it is not, then I believe that the review board that's being established by that legislation in the Senate would then promulgate that information to the general public. And they would also make the determination that if something is a matter of national security, that would be retained. And my understanding that legislation's current state is the only person that could overrule that board would be the president.
Interesting. So I guess that would sort of answer the question that one of the viewers had about, where do you sort of draw the line with what should be public and what should stay secret as a matter of national security? It sounds like they're working on that, which I'm sure that is complicated behind the scenes. Ryan, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. We really, really appreciate it.
It's really my pleasure, Brian. Thanks for having me.
Thanks.
Thanks again to Brian Entin and Ryan Graves for being with us today. Florida Congresswoman Anna Paulina Luna has been at the forefront of this issue. Following the July 26th hearing, she said, quote, "This is just the start." Congresswoman Luna joins me now via Zoom. Congresswoman, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first question I want to ask you is something that I've also asked other lawmakers who helped lead this hearing. It's about, of course, that hearing back in July. It was very interesting. There were a lot of allegations made, claims made, but important conversation about transparency. And of course, there was a lot of planning that went into this hearing, as you spoke about. I'm curious, what were you most surprised by what you heard?
You know, this is the first time that in congressional history that not only have you had confirmation from people that have been very credible working not only within the government, for the government, admitting to the fact that we are not alone, but more importantly, it was a bipartisan push for transparency. And it was actually very surprising in a good way to hear that both Democrats and Republicans were calling for not only there to be stronger whistleblower protections, as you heard from Grush as he was testifying, not only is he in fear for his safety, but also too that he was facing retribution for coming forward with this information. And then also too, we are still actively being stonewalled in regards to his security clearance so that he can actually brief us. So, I mean, these are all things that going into it, we know, but it's important that it's admitted into the congressional record because, as you know, they're testifying under oath, and it's important evidence for the American people.
I want to get to another point at the top of the conversation. I was particularly excited to talk to you about this topic because you come to it with a unique perspective. You served in the Air Force. You've spoken about conversations that you've had with people who are pilots who have been afraid to come forward with allegations and claims. I presume you have knowledge of what goes on in the airspace up above, and you yourself have worked on an airfield. So I'm curious, how do you bring that background? How has that background guided your perspective on this issue, and particularly your advocacy for transparency for UAPs?
Yeah, of course. Thanks for bringing that up. A lot of people are, they don't necessarily know that I am a vet. So my job was airfield management. So I actually had a unique job in that not only did I work with pilots every single day, but I also too worked to ensure that airfields measured up to the FAA safety standards. And then also too, I would do the flight plans for pilots. So basically there's invisible roads in the sky that aircraft need to section off when they fly so that there's no safety issues. And it's incredibly important. I think a lot of people talk about the national security aspect, which is just one aspect of this, but then there's also too the civilian safety aspect. And when you have pilots, especially, you know, you heard Graves talking about that there's multiple commercial airline pilots that are unable to address these issues, to report them. They're facing retaliation from some of these corporate airlines. If they do speak out, they get letters, basically cease and desist letters. They're being threatened to lose their jobs. But also too that you have corporations putting the safety of civilians and people that are paying to use these services over basically transparency. I mean, that's not wrong, and corporatism should not do that. And so when I'm talking and I'm addressing these issues, I always like to inject that because I think a lot of people so quickly can be in the mindset of, oh, this is a conspiracy theorist or it's not true. But I think that stigma and removing that stigma is incredibly important for this discussion. So when I'm asking the questions, I keep that in mind. I also too do like to tailor the questioning to remind people of that. But it is an incredibly important part. And, you know, going back to kind of why this specific topic piqued my interest, after my time serving active duty, I was in the Guard for about a year. And I worked with F-15s. And I remember they responded to, there was an aerospace incursion. They responded immediately. They came back. They were pretty quiet about it. And then one of the pilots, I was kind of like, you know, what was that? He alluded to the fact that it was UAP. And so after that ended up happening, you know, you have pilots that are even afraid of coming forward to talk about it because they don't want the stigma of being called crazy. But as you're hearing, you know, multiple lawmakers, they're very smart people, scientists, doctors, lawyers, who all report this. And so they can't just blanket label it crazy anymore.
You mentioned transparency, and that's where I wanted to bring the conversation next. It seems like the main issue here is transparency because, you know, just to talk about some things that were said at that hearing, Grush said that the government has non-human material recovered from crash sites. As you mentioned, Graves spoke about the stigma surrounding reporting these these UFO and UAP sightings. So it seems like the issue here is transparency. If people were more transparent, we'd be aware of some of these allegations, if true, and there would potentially be a less of a stigma around reporting UFO and UAP sightings. Curious, in your opinion, how is the best way to decrease the stigma and overall increase that transparency when you talk about UAPs and UFOs?
Right now, I think that we're facing a massive issue of overclassification. Even if you, for example, let's say you were flying and you recorded something on your iPhone, right? That would be considered classified information. If it had a UAP, they would obviously hide that information, even though you recorded it, it's on your device. You know, I don't believe that it is fair to the American people to not be able to see information that absolutely has the ability to impact them directly, especially from a national security perspective. And I also don't think it's fair to gaslight the American people. When you have the federal government, when you have these private entities, private agencies, individuals deciding what the American people and their representatives should see, then you no longer have a representative body of government, which is exactly what we are, which is exactly why I think that you're seeing the push from both sides for this transparency. But I would hope, and what I'm trying to accomplish and where we're going forward with this is that, you know, had Representative Gates not had the whistleblowers come forward to his office, had we not gone to Eghigian with Burchett and Gates and experienced what we experienced from the Pentagon, the Department of the Air Force, and then even being stonewalled from questioning all of the pilots that came forward, I don't think that this hearing would have happened.
You spoke about this effort to try to get information and hear more information in a SCIF, and that's what I wanted to get to next. In an interview after last month's hearing, you said, quote, "The first step in the right direction is going to be getting that information in a SCIF and seeing what we can release to the American people." What is the status of that effort in terms of you guys being able to go into a SCIF? For those who don't know, a SCIF is a sensitive facility where you're able to view sensitive documents and information. What's the status of that effort? And if you could just talk a little bit about why that would be helpful for increasing transparency and letting the American people be more aware of information that's out there.
Yeah, of course. So as you heard from Gretsch's testimony, there were some things that he could not address in the hearing because of the classification of that information. Now, the excuse that the Department of Defense is using for us not being able to get a SCIF is that Gretsch doesn't have an active clearance. So unless he has an active clearance, they're saying that he can't divulge that information to us, which is, one, I believe, false. And then also, two, it just is another point that we're trying to make, that the Department of Defense is literally trying to stonewall us. But the status is as follows. We are working on him, getting him a clearance, for one. And then also, two, we're working on getting access to be allowed to use a SCIF. And the good thing is that we have multiple lawmakers that have signed onto a letter that Representative Burchett has put forward. And then we are also requesting, and we have put out a letter to myself, Jared Moskowitz, Representative Gates, and Representative Burchett, have all signed on to a letter to Speaker McCarthy to ask for a special select committee to investigate this so that we have subpoena power. Because as you're seeing, there's so much stuff that we've had to really overcome hurdle-wise that they've just tried to throw at us to prevent us from doing this.
First, I just want to follow up on the SCIF part. You mentioned in an interview following the July hearing that you were going to put pressure on the Intelligence Committee to provide lawmakers with a SCIF with this information. Can you elaborate on what kind of pressure you're talking about here?
Whether it's public pressure, whether it's naming names, whether it is literally doing, as you saw, with putting out letters and requests. You know, the fact is that Gretsch has received pushback from the intelligence community. Even Representative Burchett had stated in the hearing that when he filed an amendment to a bill for the FAA so that we could simply get reporting back to Congress so that we could investigate the topics of UAP, that it was the intelligence community that actually killed the amendment in the FAA bill. You know, the intelligence community is not above law, and they're not above the American people. It is a select group of people that have become these megalomaniacs with information and think that they can control everything.
I spoke to Congressman Burchett as part of this event, and he told me that he doesn't think that Congress will be able to stage more hearings on this issue until a select committee is created. He just doesn't. That's just how he thinks the sequence of events will be. I'm curious to know if you agree with him that the select committee will have to be established for there to be more hearings on the topic.
I think for doing the hearings in Washington, he's correct, because that subpoena power is so powerful, especially with some of these agencies that you're seeing that are trying to stonewall us or play games with this entire situation. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we can't do the field hearings. And I think the field hearings, again, are very important because we can bring the press, we can bring the people directly to these areas where we know that they're either hiding information or they're not being fully transparent. And then we can put the public pressure campaigns on that. But yes, Representative Burchett is correct. The select committee would be incredibly powerful. And I think that, it was Speaker McCarthy that actually basically allowed us to do this hearing. So I think that he is supportive, although I haven't heard back directly from his office because we signed on to the letter, but the letter did not come from our office initially. So it would be an update, I believe, from Representative Gates' office.
You floated the possibility of defunding individuals if transparency is not increased. I just want to read the exact quote. You said, quote, "If we continue to see this wall of silence where they're giving us the runaround, we reserve the right to actually defund positions." I just wanted to ask, who exactly are you talking about when you're talking about defunding, and how exactly would you go about that? Is something like the Holman Rule, or do you have something else in mind?
No, 100% is the Holman Rule. That's kind of one of our toolkits that we have as Congress. Obviously, no, Congress has the power of the purse, so we can defund any federally appointed position if we see that they are stonewalling us and not acting in the vested interest of the American people. And again, that's not just Republicans saying this, is Democrats too that would support that. So as of right now, based on the responses that we received back, and really I think that there's a lot riding on whether or not we get the select committee. But even then, so when we are pursuing this, let's say we go to Eglin Air Force Base, they don't want to bring the information forward that they showed us. We know it's not classified and that we can bring it forward. That's in that instance where we would actually bring forward that legislation for the appropriations to defund those positions.
All right, Congresswoman Anna Paulina Luna, Republican from Florida, thank you so much for joining us today. A really important and interesting conversation.
Thank you.
Between 1947 and 1969, the U.S. Air Force investigated unidentified flying objects, commonly referred to as UFOs, as part of the Project Blue Book, which was based at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. More than 12,000 sightings were reported to the project, that's according to the Air Force, and 701 of them are still unidentified. But David Grush, a former intelligence officer who testified at last month's hearing, has claimed that the U.S. government has likely been aware of, quote, non-human activity since the 1930s. Joining me now to dig into some of this history is Greg Eghigian. Greg is a professor at Penn State University and is writing a book on the history of UFO sightings. Greg, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Sure, my pleasure.
I was really looking forward to talking to you because you've been studying and writing about UAPs and UFOs for years. I think that, some folks who are just tuning into the issue, it's something new for them that they're studying. But again, you've been digging into this for a while. So to start us off, what do you think is the most important thing people should know when starting to learn about and starting to discuss UAPs and UFOs?
Oh, it's what should be obvious almost right from the start, that right from the very beginning of the first sightings, it's been really enveloped in controversy and in debate. There's never been any consensus or clear agreement among both civilians, people in the military, scientists about just exactly what was going on. And therefore, the entire phenomenon has been really shrouded in a lot of politics at times.
And so, we talk about that politics. It gets me right into my next question. Of course, there was that very high-profile hearing on Capitol Hill last month. It actually had less politics than other congressional hearings. It was more of a bipartisan basis. But I was curious, what are your main takeaways from that hearing? And you penned an op-ed afterwards, and you wrote, quote, "Just how historic the hearing was is up for debate." I'm curious what exactly you meant by that.
Well, because I think two things. One is all three of the witnesses had spoken out in public beforehand about this, so we kind of knew what they were going to say. The other thing is we didn't come away, therefore, with a lot of new information. Yes, people spoke under oath, but that was about it. I think the big takeaway for me is to actually zoom out a bit. It's really easy to get caught up in the personalities involved and in all the things that have happened subsequent to those hearings. I think one of the things that is really noteworthy about this, particularly in the case of David Grush, is that the entire sort of narrative about how to understand what he is saying and about the veracity of it has been built around his credibility. Do we believe this man? And what I want to say about that, and I think that's really important, is that when we make this stuff about assessing an individual's credibility, you're getting into people's character. You're getting into assessments of and speculation about a person's honesty, a person's integrity and virtue. And I think that partly explains why things have played out the way they have in the last week or so since then, because in a sense, it creates a kind of a false path for us. I think as we go down the road further along here, what we're really going to need to be grounded in is hard facts, data, artifacts, things like that. And I think that's what a lot of people are waiting for.
No, that's absolutely an interesting point. And we spoke to a few other lawmakers who have been part of this push for more transparency and this effort regarding UAPs on Capitol Hill. And one of their next steps is getting access to some of that sensitive information, that classified information that was discussed during the hearing. So, to get behind what are just some claims right now, to actually see the evidence behind it. So that is an interesting point. I also wanted to ask you, what do you think that lawmakers should be paying attention to specifically on this topic of UAPs? There are some lawmakers who are pushing to create a select committee, hold more hearings, both in Washington and field hearings. What exactly do you think they should be focusing on?
Well, it all depends on what you're really after here. I mean, of course, when it comes to national security, you're interested in, of course, finding out whether there's any data out there to indicate that there's reason to fear for national security issues when it comes to UAP. There seems to be, on the basis of what Arrow and Sean Fitzpatrick's group Arrow has concluded, in the sense that they have said that there are, in fact, many instances in which there are real physical objects out there that they can't explain, and that at the very least they fear for pilot safety. So there's some evidence to indicate there's national security issues at this. On the other hand, I would say there's another side to this that often gets lost in the shuffle with the focus on the military, and that is science. That is the side that has gotten also explored a bit by this UAP study team headed by David Spergel through NASA, right? And that's another side to this issue of where might it be, in fact, civilian scientists who are independent, who really have no stakeholding position in all of these things, where might they fit into all of this?
You bring up David Spergel, and he's someone who I wanted to ask you about. He's the chairman of the NASA panel that is currently studying UFOs. And in June, he said, quote, "The current existing data and eyewitness reports alone are insufficient to provide conclusive evidence about the nature and origin of every UAP event." And he went on to say that NASA needs, quote, "better targeted data collection through data curation and robust analysis." So how can this data collection be improved, right? Because if we're going through the motions of collecting this data and then studying it, but now some experts are saying that the data that they have isn't sufficient enough to learn about this large phenomenon that we're trying to understand better. How can they better collect that data to overall paint a better picture of what's going on?
It's a challenge, and he admitted as such in that public meeting that was held. It sounds like that what first of all has to be done, which is what in fact that team was just beginning to do, was start to get around the table a bunch of people with a lot of different expertises and trainings and methods to begin to establish, as he put it, a roadmap. How might we go forward, not to get answers, but just to begin the process of asking the right questions and then trying to find a way to not only get data, but to collect it, store it, analyze it. All of that seems to me very much in flux. One of the challenges that they are facing, that he also admitted, is that, of course, some of this material, some of this data is classified material and data that is not accessible to this study panel and wouldn't be accessible to most civilian scientists. So that's going to be also a bit of a hurdle along the way.
Another hurdle seems to be, or rather than hurdle, but just the overall theme throughout the UAP journey up on Capitol Hill seems to be the issue of transparency, right? This was an idea that lawmakers were really emphasizing, was that there's a lack of transparency. I want to read something that you wrote in your LA Times op-ed following the hearing. You said, quote, "The demand for greater government openness about UFOs has a long history dating back to the very first wave of flying saucer sightings in 1947. And you later added, as far back as the 1960s, however, others like atmospheric physicist James McDonald believed government's blasé attitude towards UFOs stemmed from incompetence and ignorance." So, this whole idea of transparency and decreasing the stigma, as you mentioned right there, it seems like it's been an ongoing theme in this conversation about UAPs. I'm curious, now that it seems that the government is more invested, of course, we saw last month's hearing, lawmakers on Capitol Hill are very galvanized about it. There's a push for a select committee. Do you think that we'll see more transparency and a decrease of that stigma surrounding this very nuanced but highly interesting topic?
Well, I think transparency and stigma are maybe two separate things, but I think the one thing when it comes to transparency, at least, that we have to remember is everyone's definition of transparency is different. And particularly that applies when you're talking about the government and branches of government. So transparency isn't and doesn't mean the same thing to one group or to one institution that it might to another. I think we will be limited in the amount of transparency we will have. That is, I think, to be expected when you're dealing with things that involve, for instance, sensors and devices and technologies of surveillance that the military, maybe quite rightly, doesn't want to reveal anything about, or at least about its existence or workings. On the other hand, this story of transparency throughout history has been really marred and marked by a lot of starts, fits, stops along the way. And that is because, in fact, at times, as I say, nobody could be quite clear on what that transparency might look like. And so one of the problems I think that we have is that for a lot of critics of the government, when it comes to transparency issues involving UFOs or UAP, one of the big problems is that it's never been clear what kind of information will satisfy some of those critics. And in some cases, it seems that almost nothing will satisfy critics until they get the kind of result that they foresee or they believe is out there. And that also is one of the kind of challenges that I think people interested in transparency have ahead of them.
No, it's some fascinating dynamics there. I want to squeeze in one question from an audience member before we have to wrap up. This one's from
Sure.
Carlos Sims. He's an energy project engineer at the Washington State Department of Enterprise Services, and he wants to know, is there an increased number of UAP reports around U.S. military bases and nuclear facilities?
The newest results of a study that was done under the auspices of RAND just came out very recently, established or at least showed some indications that what we see is an uptick of reports, and in fact, a kind of a concentration of reported sightings that are within around 30 kilometers of military operations, not military installations or military bases or nuclear facilities, but where there are military operations. And this is a really interesting finding. The authors of this piece make the argument, what one of the things this might indicate is that the government, and particularly the military, when they conduct these kinds of exercises, might want to inform the public a little more about them in advance so that you don't get a lot of false positives along the way.
Fascinating stuff, fascinating information. Greg Eghigian, thank you so much for joining us. Really interesting conversation.
My pleasure. Thanks.
And that brings us to the end of our event today. Thank you so much to our speakers and to you for joining us. Remember, you can rewatch our event on thehill.com and on our YouTube page. Thanks for joining us for an out-of-this-world event. We had to. How could we not? I'm Michael Schnell. Enjoy the rest of your day.